quick intro anyways.
Okay. So, as I mentioned, I'm the communications director for the Sisters of the Sorrowful Mother. I've served on their Justice, Peace, and Integrity of Creation Committee for around the last 4 years. I've also worked pretty closely with anti-human trafficking organizations in Wisconsin, in particular Five Stones, I Heart World, Lotus Legal Clinic, the Women's Community, the Human Thread, the Wisconsin Anti-Human Trafficking Consortium. I also serve on the Leadership Conference of Women Religious Region 9 Anti-Human Trafficking Task Force. And our group was responsible for mailing the educational parish toolkits to every parish in Wisconsin last year. So the information that's in front of you was included in a parish toolkit. It's also available online, and I'll discuss that when we get to that slide. And then I also serve on the Communications Committee for U.S. Catholic Sisters Against Human Trafficking, which is why you'll see their logo on many of these slides. I'm using one of the templates that we developed, and we're hoping that other people will pick up this presentation and use it across the United States and just tailor it to their particular state. Obviously, this is tailored to Wisconsin. And then I just began volunteering also with Reach Counseling Services and Nina as a victim advocate. And they are in need of victim advocates. That's someone who goes to the hospital with someone who needs to go through a sexual assault nursing exam and be there for them. And that would be victims of sexual assault and abuse, but also victims of human trafficking. So to begin, first of all, I'd like to thank you all for coming, obviously, and being interested in this topic. I think that, as Catholics, we're called to help those in need in our communities. And as Proverbs tells us, we need to speak up and defend the rights of those in need. I originally presented this at Catholics at the Capitol last Tuesday in Madison. So some of the information is tied to the Catholic faith and how we're called as Catholics to help with the situation. So this is just an overview of the presentation. We're going to talk about what human trafficking is. I'm sure there's a wide range of levels of knowledge about what human trafficking is, so I want to kind of hit on the key points. And then Catholic social teaching, how that ties into human trafficking, victims of human trafficking, who's at risk, how traffickers will recruit and manipulate these victims, signs of a victim, and then some real-life examples. We'll talk about legislation, how victims need to heal, the needed infrastructure of response, what you can do, and some resources. So what is human trafficking? Essentially, it's modern-day slavery. You may think that slavery doesn't exist in the world, but it absolutely does. And there are actually more slaves in the world today than ever before in human history. There are about 21 million people held in bondage, exploited for commercial sex or forced labor. That's according to the International Labor Organization. And when we talk about human trafficking, we're basically talking about two types. There's sex trafficking and labor trafficking. I have been reading quite a few books about human trafficking, and there are some really powerful memoirs written by survivors. And I have a couple books here for you to see. I forgot the rest of mine, but I have a lot of books. You can just go on Amazon and search for human trafficking books or human trafficking memoirs. But Nita Bells wrote a book called In Our Backyard, and it's actually up there. And she has so many good passages in this book. I thought this really summed up what human trafficking is. Human trafficking is one of the worst atrocities happening in our world at this time. It is the deliberate control, manipulation, force, and torture of a human being whose rights have been overtaken by another human being. Human trafficking is a very hidden crime. It's really hard to spot in our everyday lives because traffickers are so skilled at hiding their victims, often right in plain sight. But the key terms are force, fraud, and coercion. And that's how they control their victims physically, mentally, and emotionally. So force is using physical violence. Fraud involves false promises regarding employment, wages, working conditions, things like that. And with labor trafficking situations, fraud is very commonly involved. They will promise them a job, and then once the victim arrives at the workplace location, it is not what it was believed to be. And then with sex trafficking, For fraud, perpetrators may lure victims in with promises of a job, of maybe cocktail waitressing. Modeling is very common, modeling, exotic dancing, and then when they get there, they're forced into pornography and prostitution. And coercion is when the victim is psychologically manipulated to believe that their failure to perform an act or their job would result in serious physical harm or violence against themselves, against their friends, against their family. And they're also made to believe that if they attempt escape, they will be followed, tracked down, arrested, or even killed. So why is human trafficking such a lucrative crime? Well, right now it's the third largest international crime industry with an estimated global industry of about $150 billion a year. Again, these are estimates because a lot of this is kept quiet, is hidden, but it's quickly approaching to be the second largest criminal industry. The first is drugs and second is arms. But human trafficking is lucrative because of the repeated sale. You can repeatedly sell someone's body for sex or for their labor, whereas drugs and arms is much riskier. You can only sell them once. It's estimated that 2/3 of human trafficking is sex trafficking and 1/3 is labor trafficking. In the world, as I mentioned, they estimate about 21 million people to be victims, and of these, about 5.5 million are children under the age of 18. In the US, they estimate about 100 to 300,000 children are commercially, sexually exploited every year. And again, a lot of this goes unreported, so they do their best to estimate, extrapolating the figures that they do have on research on this. Since Polaris is a national organization, since they began their national human trafficking hotline and gathering data and information in 2007, they've been able to use that data to learn a lot more about the nature of this crime. So last year, 2,042 victims contacted the National Human Trafficking Hotline. That was, let's see, that's an increase over the previous years, about 24% increase. Every year, the Human Trafficking Hotline has an increase in number of calls and number of trafficking cases reported. And that's in great part due to the promotion of the hotline. Something that the sisters did this past 2 years is collaboratively work with other organizations to sponsor bus signage and billboards in Wisconsin. And we place them regionally to cover the entire state. And as a result of that, I believe, I have it later in my presentation, but it was something like a 30% increase in calls to the human trafficking hotline. So it's a good thing because more victims are reaching out. It's a sad thing because we realize there are a lot more victims, I think, than we even anticipated. Anyone can call this human trafficking hotline. It's actually available in 200 languages. So you call in and tell them what language you want and they'll dispatch across. Since 2007, when they started the hotline, they've had over 31,000 human trafficking cases reported and 145,000 calls, texts, and emails. So it is an incredible resource. Polaris is the nonprofit organization based out of Washington, D.C. that operates that hotline, and it does cost them millions of dollars to operate that 24/7 and have it available in 200 languages. So this is just a high-level overview of who is being trafficked. And really quick, I forgot to tell you, I can email this presentation to anyone who would like it. I'm also going to be placing it online. I have a video recording now, and then I'm also going to be placing it online on our Facebook, so you can click the link and review it. So just a demographics overview and the limited demographic information that we have. You can still hear me okay? Sister Cherie, you good back there? Okay. Are you telling me something? Oh, okay. She was waving at me. Okay, the National Human Trafficking Hotline number is on the little business cards that are in front of you. So that the little business card is Know the Red Flags victims, and it has the hotline on there for you. Okay, that's what you're saying. The demographics overview, about 70% adults, 30% children under the age of 18, and female, it skews female, 98% of sex trafficking victims are female, and 55% of forced labor victims. And they estimate about 1/3 of street-level prostitution and 1/2 of off-street prostitution are victims under the age of 18. The average age a child is coerced into sex trafficking for girls is 13, so it's 12 to 14 years old. They usually say 13, and then 11 to 13 for boys. So these are very young girls that we're talking about, average. I did put the races up there just to basically say it can happen to any race. The statistics gathered from the hotline have a little bit of a difference between the different races, but they're very close. I mean, they have Latino first, Asian, white, African American, and multiracial. This can happen to any girl of any race, any socioeconomic status in the United States. And so we're talking about labor trafficking and sex trafficking. Where is this happening, and what activities are they trafficked for? Well, sex trafficking is basically prostitution, pornography, exotic dancing, and this will be in hotels, personal residences, a lot of times, and strip clubs and other areas like that. Labor trafficking in Wisconsin is primarily agricultural work, manual labor, construction, landscaping, things like that, but there also is a rise in childcare labor trafficking, hiring nannies, bringing them over, so in people's private homes. This is the National Human Trafficking map of where their calls came from. And it just indicates where it's most prevalent in the United States, but it's pretty red all over. It's obviously, you can see Wisconsin there, Chicago, Milwaukee area, and up north, Fox City is where we are, is red. So it's definitely prevalent. This year, they did start trying to dive a little bit deeper and ask victims more demographic, psychographic information, try and get more data collected, but it's a very sensitive topic, so they need to be careful when they're dealing with victims and asking them questions. So in Wisconsin, about 80% is sex trafficking and 20% is labor trafficking. So this presentation is going to focus mostly on sex trafficking. Last year, the hotline had 63 human trafficking cases reported and 322 calls from Wisconsin. Let's see, and then 2014, this is what I was saying before. So the last 2 years, there's been a 70% increase in calls, 70%, and 46% increase in cases. Trafficking occurs in both urban and rural areas. If you look in front of you, the handout that says sex trafficking in Wisconsin, that shows you an overview. It's an infographic, visuals to help give you statistics in digestible format. But you'll see there the route through Wisconsin is often Milwaukee, up to Fox City's Green Bay, over to Wausau, over to Minneapolis. Sometimes they'll come back around, they'll go down to Chicago, and they'll make a circle. They move their victims a lot because they don't want the victims to have any roots in any community that they're in. It's easier to manipulate them that way. Okay, this is a video. I'm actually going to go to the internet for this one. This is called Muted, and this was posted 4 months ago, and it's just a quick overview of human trafficking in Wisconsin. I'm going to skip some of the parts just to be respectful of our time. But the woman talking, her name is Nicole, and she's a sex trafficking survivor. She lived in Fox Cities and went down to Milwaukee and Chicago and came back up. But I met her in person, and her story is very, very powerful. So I'll just play this a little bit here for you.
Sex trafficking isn't just a problem that happens in big cities. It affects small communities as well. In Wisconsin alone, Appleton is the third largest city for sex trafficking. With the problem so hidden, how can we stop the victimization of these women?
Go to them. Before I got into this lifestyle, I was living in the Fox Cities. I had a pretty broken childhood. I was abandoned at a young age and adopted and then disowned and then in foster care, and then I just became a runaway. So while on the run, I got into law trouble. So that just made me run farther. I ended up in Milwaukee on the streets and fell prey to people who would benefit from my vulnerability.
when we arrest a prostitute, and the public has a
Bear with me for a second.
out of the family, but my son is. I'm a horrible mother. I can't take care of him. I'm irresponsible. He would be better off with another family. So
Her
he
pimp told
directed
her
me to
she had
take
to
my
give up her
child
son.
to the hospital, fire station, or police station and leave him there. I said, okay. I hung up the phone and I called the police. I had told the police many times before about him, but I figured this time, because my child was involved, that they would help me and help.
I just want to show you, that's how she got out of the life. It's very difficult for victims to get out of the life, but once the pimp threatened her child, that was the last straw for her.
At risk of getting into things. And now where we stand, as we're teaching awareness and as we're reaching out further, we realize that we're going to have to impact the entire community, also toward the adult victims.
The impact that I had on me emotionally was that I pretty much detached from that situation. I didn't have much choices. I didn't have family at the time. I didn't have, I was in trouble with the law. My life was, a wreck. I was pretty hopeless. I didn't really think much about the future. I just thought about how I'm gonna get through each day.
Within our community, if the women would rally and the women would work together to make a difference, if the men would open their eyes to the victimization, I believe we can make a difference. And the problem is, if we don't do something, we're going to drown.
Every day I feel very blessed that I'm not in that life anymore. So, but I also feel very sad because I know, all around me in this world that there are women out there still being victimized, still being trafficked, and they have no hope. And I know what that feels like. So it hurts my heart. It hurts my heart to know that there's not enough being done for them and that they need somebody to care. And I know what that's like. I know what it's like to sit there and scream for help and nobody answering that help.
Okay, this next one, I don't know, some of you may have heard that Milwaukee is considered the pimp training capital of the United States. This is a news video that discusses an FBI operation. It's called Operation Cross Country, and every year they spend a few days going across the United States collaborating with law enforcement to try and rescue victims and arrest pimps and johns.
The story the I-Team's been tracking for months.
Over the weekend, more than 100 people were busted in Wisconsin. 6 girls were rescued in Milwaukee, 1 in West Dallas, 1 in Oak Creek, and 2 in Madison.
As Charles Benson reports, child sex slaves are being sold right in our own backyard. Charles.
This is the second year the Milwaukee FBI office has participated in the nationwide crackdown of child sex trafficking. And once again, Milwaukee area ranks near the top of the list of the children who were recovered or rescued. As the FBI and local law enforcement aggressively go after child sex trafficking in states all across the country, Maria isn't surprised Milwaukee is one of the most active cities.
What was your first reaction?
Sad and excited at the same time because we're finally doing something about this.
Sad because so many girls are lured into the sex trafficking world, including her daughter, who is still struggling with it.
These girls are pushed into doing prostitution.
We first reported this month about the FBI's new squad unit dedicated to this problem. Investigators can't explain why Southeast Wisconsin is so active in the child sex trafficking business.
A couple of years ago, quite frankly, it was not on our radar. And then until we started getting all these reports from other cities, other divisions, that the girls were coming in from Wisconsin.
The FBI says its work is far from over. Maria's message, keep going after the bad guys.
It's sad.
So what does our faith teach us about this type of situation? Pope Francis has been very vocal about the scourge of human trafficking and that we need to stand up and help rectify this situation. He's saying, the quote that I've most often seen from Pope Francis is this one: "Human trafficking is an open wound on the body of contemporary society. All people are equal and must be accorded the same freedom and the same dignity. Modern slavery is a crime against humanity." So in terms of Catholic social teaching, Catholic social teaching focuses on the dignity of every human person. And we are to respond to every threat that would undermine that human dignity because every person is made in God's image. The Catholic Catechism lists human enslavement as a violation of the seventh commandment because it is stealing from other humans their dignity, their freedom, their right to the fruits of their labor. So no human person should be subject to violence or considered only a means to making a profit. The Vatican actually published this in 2007 as a call to action for Catholics. They published this on their website. "We call upon all Catholics to seek ways to assist dioceses and local governments in helping survivors. Catholics can also help educate other fellow Catholics and others about the consequences of this crime." So next we're going to talk about who's at risk. Who are the victims of human trafficking? And really, this can happen to any young person in any setting. And because of that, it's very vital for us as adults to take responsibility to try and prevent this from happening by being proactive with young people. So even though this can happen to anyone at any time, there are risk factors that make some young people more vulnerable than others. We call them at-risk youth. Often these youth will have trouble at home, within their family, at school. The history of abuse is a huge factor. They estimate about 80% of sex trafficking victims were abused as children. And also running away is a huge vulnerability for these children. And then also children who are different some way. They're bullied, they're disconnected from others, they're unsure of their sexual identity, they're depressed or physically or mentally disabled, or they may have already been involved with social services, they may have a history of addiction. However, running away is the #1 at-risk factor for youth to becoming victims. And I could not believe this when I read it. Oops, I went too far. But in the United States, there are 800,000 missing children reported every year. That's 2,200 a day. And in Wisconsin alone, there's 26,000 missing reported youth every year. Out of the youth who are out on the streets, 1 in 3 runaway teens will be approached by a sex trafficker within 48 hours. So just a little more from a psychological perspective of who's at risk in the youth. There's 4 categories that psychologists have indicated that can make young people a little more susceptible to traffickers, predators. The needy desperately need attention and love, affirmation. They're the ones frequently posting selfies on Facebook or put downs. The trafficker will find them, start giving them compliments, building them up, adoration, and their self-worth quickly becomes dependent on that trafficker. The lonely have parents who are gone or they're shuttled in between them. This can lead to them choosing unhealthy coping activities. And this predator will find them and soon encourage them to come to them with their emotional needs. The angry are kids who are given money and freedom, but they don't have any parental time, no boundaries. They fend emotionally for themselves, and that can result in bitterness and rebellion. And the predators will start relationships with them and get them to complain about their parents in exchange for sympathy, and they often will end up offering them a place to run away to, offer them shelter. And then the confident and clueless are those kids who are naive, but they feel invincible, and they'll do daredevil things to impress their friends. So these are the ones that would be the ones, that would get in a car and, get a ride home from a stranger from the mall or something like that. Now, in terms of adults, the The risk factors are similar, obviously. When we're talking adults, we're talking still young people, 18, 19, 20, 21. And so that same, history of abuse, mental or physical disabilities. But the thing with some young adults, they may have children already, they may be desperate to provide for their families, but they can be manipulated, just like a child. They just might not be quite as vulnerable as a younger child. So how did they become victims? So sex trafficking recruitments, one of the talks that I was at, the Appleton police officer was saying, he works with the Milwaukee police as well, and was saying that they'll have police outside the schools, in particular Milwaukee and Chicago, watching, and they see the perpetrators, they see the pimps, watching these kids and watching, and they're analyzing them. They're looking for the ones that are off by themselves or alone or aloof. But they can't do anything about it because you can't arrest someone for sitting in your car and watching children. So they're very frustrated. They know that these pimps are studying these young girls. They'll go to anywhere that young people congregate. They'll go to malls, schools, parks, on the street, and then of course online. And a lot of labor trafficking is just recruited straight online. They will go to some low-income communities and try to find people who are desperate for employment, and they will target immigrants as well, in particular undocumented immigrants. So essentially, victimization is all about targeting and false promises. For sex trafficking, they're lured into the life with love, and for labor trafficking, basically offered a job. Now, labor trafficking, just an overview of labor trafficking. As I mentioned before, they may apply for a job, and then when they arrive, realize that, formatting's a little off, but realize that it's not everything that they promised. They may be forced to work long hours with little to no pay. They may be told that they owe recruitment fees to their trafficker. They'll take their ID cards and their passports. They're not free to come and go as they wish. In Wisconsin, this happens in vacation destinations. Actually, Wisconsin Dells is one of the biggest human trafficking centers in Wisconsin. Also potato farms, dairy farms. I put potatoes on there because one of the cases that Project Respect was working on was a labor trafficking case kind of in the Wausau area involving potato farms. And most of these things, you and I walking around, we're not going to see. It's all hidden, but it's definitely happening. And sometimes it takes a crisis event in order for the public to know that that's happening, and that may be through, an accident. This one was through a car accident. They were transporting, I think, 6 labor workers, and the van got in an accident. And they ended up in the hospital, and that's how they uncovered it. Labor trafficking, there's also an infographic that I created in the handouts that you have that shows you about labor trafficking in Wisconsin. And then also, labor trafficking, they often will find that they're being monitored 24/7. They have high security measures that they can't escape if they would want to. And a lot of these victims may not know the language. So, they may be in fear of, just from a cultural perspective, being isolated. And then they're often threatened both physically and psychologically. Now there is what's called a T visa for victims, which allows undocumented victims to stay in the United States to assist the federal authorities with prosecution of human trafficking cases. I think a lot of, obviously the majority of immigrants won't even know that this is available. But this allows them to stay in the United States, and it can also extend to their immediate family members. And then once the T visa is granted, they can apply for citizenship, or I should say permanent residence, after 3 years. So they do have some rights in the United States, even though they are victims, and even though they are undocumented often. So sex trafficking, there's really 3 stages of sex trafficking, of luring a victim into it. Recruiting, manipulating, and exploiting. So when a trafficker is grooming a potential victim, they'll befriend them, they'll start the relationship, they'll try to begin to build that trust with them. So they're going to treat them like a girlfriend, give them attention and affection and love, give them gifts, take them out on dates. And when they're in the beginning stages